Hello, welcome back. I'm John Davidson and another YouTube guy with a microphone in his face. Okay, so this is the channel. If you're here for the first time, this channel is called Biblical Validity, and it's where I take a hard look at the sciences, historical scholarship, and some logic, and demonstrating that there is a very strong case that we can make for the truth, the validity of the Bible. And so it's quite a quest to embark. And today I want to start with, I think this will be a five-part series, most likely. Is there a scientific basis for an almighty personal God? So I want to show you that science really points to not only the existence of a God creator figure, but also points to a God who is personally involved in our lives. So now this segment is kind of, I think, a necessary introduction to talk about a few other things. So I won't get very deep in science on this one. When I do get deep into science, I will try to explain it in the most layman's terms I can muster. And I have a lot of experience in explaining a difficult subject over 36 years to adults. That would be mathematics. And so I'll see if I can pull that off here. Okay, so where are we going with this? Before we get to science, let's look at a few other issues. So this is my introduction. What other issues are we talking about? Well, can God be proved or disproved? I use quote marks. And also, can philosophy settle the existence of God? All right, I think they're good questions. So let's see what we got here. Now, what does it mean by proof? Now, mathematicians, that's our bailiwick. That's what we do. We prove stuff. And proof means demonstrating absolute truth based on a foundation of basic assumptions. And really, it's only in mathematics where you find proof. And a lot of people assume that science has proved that the Bible is wrong, or they proved evolution, or they proved the Big Bang, or a lot of other things. And no, science can't prove stuff. It can only amass theories and back them up with evidence, and or try to. And so anyway, but that's what proof means. Now, disproof is often achieved by demonstrating a contradiction. In math, we call that a counterexample. So you find a contradiction and say, oh, your theory must be wrong. Okay. And let me just give you a quick example of that. Don't really have to know your math for this one, but here's a quick disproof from math. Several hundred years ago, there was an algebraic expression. I forgot exactly what it is. I could probably figure it out. That gives you prime numbers anytime you let x equal to any whole number between 1 and 40. So there's a expression, if you feed numbers into it, it gives you prime numbers, and it works 40 times in a row. Well, that's pretty persuasive, isn't it? And but it's not true when x equals to 41. So when you get to that 41st number, it doesn't work. You don't get a prime number. And so that is actually enough to disprove the idea that that expression could always give you prime numbers when you let x equal to a whole number. All right, so that's just an example where we can disprove something with a counter example. Now, I want to tie this to what we're talking about here. Detractors of the Bible sometimes eagerly latch on to anything that appears to contradict the Bible. In their mind, they only need one quick contradiction or counterexample to conclude that the Bible is unreliable and does not have consistent validity. All right, so you see kind of snarky people sometimes. Well, yeah, how can you do that? Science disproves this. Or, how do you explain this through science? Well, not so quick there. Often these people are simply criticizing something they have not tried to understand. All right, so I pointed this out in another video. I think it's human nature for us to criticize things we don't understand, and that's a trap, or can be a trap. And so not so fast there on trying to disprove the Bible through one statement. Okay, there's probably a good explanation behind all that. Okay, now, actually, this is why I started this channel, to demonstrate the powerful evidence that the Bible is valid. All right, that's why I'm here. Okay, Now, so can God be proved or disproved? Okay. Uh, yes and no. It really depends. It depends on what you're talking about. Yeah, it's possible to prove God if you're looking at it from this is a short version, from a very personal worldview standpoint. But from a global standpoint, can you prove God or disprove God? No, you can't. But anyway, I'll go into some detail here. For many people, the existence of God is a very strong, highly personal part of their worldview. I talked about worldview in a previous video, the sort of our foundation for beliefs. Okay, but some people are actually indifferent about the issue of God. And some of them are actually much more focused on their self-interest. And they give little or no time to thinking about anything related to God. All right, so you know people like this. They're too wrapped up in what they're doing. And okay, just throw that out there. Um, there's a interesting quote I found recently. In 1985, the famous Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So he was this whole Russian. Now, someone of my generation will remember Solzhenitsyn. He finally got kicked out of the Soviet Union, and he's lucky, lucky they just didn't put a bullet through his head. But he was too famous by that point to just kill him quietly. Anyway, he got out of the Soviet Union in the 1970s. In 1985, he said that the Russian people allowed the evils of communism in when they forgot God. So I love that quote. Are we forgetting God today? You know, all the crazy people out there protesting and doing violence in the streets, all kinds of stuff going on that, uh, whew, have they forgotten God? That's a question for you. Okay. Now, most people do have an opinion about the existence of God. I would say so. But some people simply do not know or care about it. And so you might call them agnostic. Agnostic means they really don't care. They don't really have an opinion about it. And so they don't really think about it. Okay, so yeah, so there are believers in God, there's atheists, and there's the ones in between you might say are agnostic. Yeah, we don't know. That's their attitude. Okay, now back to this question: can God be proved or disproved? Can God, in a scientifically defensible sense, the answer has to be no. And I think it's easy to see, but we'll run through it. You might say that by definition, God, if he exists, must be supernatural. Okay, does that make sense? We've never seen God in our physical realm. And so, well, okay, if God's out there, he must be somewhere else, okay, outside our physical senses, outside of our physical universe. If there is a supernatural realm, it is beyond the detection of our physical senses and our physical instruments. Does that make sense? So it is impossible to scientifically detect God. Okay, we can't detect God. And in the next video, I'll show that the science actually gives a powerful evidence for the existence of a supernatural realm, even though it cannot detect it. So that might be kind of a surprising statement. And how in the world are we going to pull that off? Well, it it's kind of been around for, you know, you might say 150 years. The idea that, oh, wait a minute, science is pointing to God, modern science. Okay, so we'll go through that in another video. The only way to disprove that God exists is to prove that a supernatural realm does not exist. Well, that's not possible by scientific methods either. You know, how are you going to prove that there is no supernatural realm? Just because your instruments don't detect it does not imply there is no God. So, one way or the other, we cannot say just through strictly scientific experiment methods, through scientific instruments, through our physical senses, we can't say that God exists or does not exist. And actually, I think that's by God's design. Okay, I really think he does that. It seems like you know, if you're a believer, well, why does God hide from us? That's a very interesting question. Maybe we'll tackle it one of these days. Okay. Um, Did I just repeat my... Uh, so since we cannot detect the supernatural realm, logically there still can be a supernatural realm. Okay. We're just unable to prove or disprove the existence of God. All right, so I might be kind of repeating myself there, but let me run through that. All right, but many people are thoroughly convinced that God exists or does not exist. This is ingrained in our personal worldview. On a personal level, it can rise to the level of proof, a conviction that absolute truth in the matter is realized based upon their experiences. All right, so some people, probably most of us, have strong feelings one way or the other, and to us, we have a proof that either God exists or does not exist. All right, and speaking for myself, I believe the existence of God has been proved to me based upon a lifetime of experiences. And this could be the way it is for many believers. We all come to God in very different ways, or can, and because we're all unique. And and there are a lot of ways to not believe in God either. So anyway, so to me, it's too much evidence over a lifetime. Uh, Too much coincidence. After a while, you think that can't be coincidence. All right, so let's see. God being disproved in someone's worldview may be a matter of them not seeing any evidence. It may be that simple. Some people would say, well, I just don't see evidence for God. Why should I believe in him? Um, but atheism can be more complicated. Sometimes it's based upon a bitterness. And now, I'm not, I have no expertise in psychology. I really don't want to go there, so I won't go deep into this at all. But there are people who seem to be angry at a God they claim does not exist. How much sense does that make? Well, this is due to hardships they have suffered for which God did not help them. So they're mad at God, even though they don't think he exists, because God was not there to fix their problems. He just must be a mean guy or whatever. And so that's I think some people kind of believe that way. I think other people are atheists because they're afraid of being accountable to a higher power, and I'm sure there are a lot of other reasons. So like I said, I don't think I should really try to tackle all that psychology. Okay, now, on a different front. Now, how does philosophy or theology approach the question? And what is theology? Is that the philosophy of spiritual matters? I don't know. Anyway, maybe it's the study of spiritual matters. Anyway, I guess I could look it up. Okay, how does philosophy approach this question of existence? Well, philosophers use logical arguments based on agreed definitions and assumptions in order to persuade. Now, I'm not a professional philosopher by any remote sense at all, so if one of you are and you come on, you might set me straight on this. Maybe I'm off on this definition. But to me, that's what strikes me about philosophy. And so, in a sense, philosophers offer proofs for their arguments. Yeah, they using logic and their basic assumptions and their agreed to definitions, they can prove their argument. But since these are always based upon a set of assumptions or premises, their proofs leave room for people to disagree based upon the premises for their great arguments. All right, so people can always argue with, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure I agree with you on how you started this line of argument. All right, and all right, so I got an example here. As an example, mathematician and philosopher Rene Descartes. If you've taken algebra and seen the XY plane, you can blame that on Descartes. Um, Descartes actually made math easier because he was one of the early adopters of the notation we use in algebra, and so we kind of owe him a debt for that. But he's a very famous philosopher too in his day. He lived in the early 1600s, we'll say. He famously used the phrase cogito ergo sum, and that's Latin, which means I think, therefore I am. All right, you probably have heard that phrase before. Like, what in the world was he talking about? He was arguing that we are not just a part of God's imagination. So my perception of this is that people were tossing around, well, how do we prove that we're not part of God's imagination? How do we prove that we have independent thought and actions? And apparently this was rather persuasive in his day. And there are probably a few who ask, well, yeah, but what if all our thoughts are part of God's imagination? All right, that would maybe be my question. So, okay, I don't think Descartes settled the issue there with that, because the premise of his argument could be disputed. All right, when it comes to debate over God's existence or non-existence, many philosophers and theologians have weighed in over many centuries. Oh yeah, ever since right after Christ, the church, the early church fathers have been writing about all this stuff, and and a lot of this is very good. And now I'm going from memory. I tried to look this the other day. I couldn't find it, so I could be wrong. But in the 1300s, I believe it was, a theologian, William of Ockham, I think was his name. Now he was certainly a very influential church uh, theologian, philosopher, and had a lot of great writings. Anyway, I think, I could be wrong, he offered his argument for the existence of God that I find similar to the argument for the existence of infinity. All right, so let me first tell you, how would you argue for infinity? What does infinity mean? Well, given a number, you give me a number, we can always imagine a larger number. There's no end to this, so we label this concept of an unattainable largest number to be infinity. That's right, infinity is not a number. Okay. Even more mind-blowing is that there are different levels of infinity, different sizes of infinity. And I'll say that for my math channel. Okay. Actually, I think I do have video out on that that's probably about 15 years old. Okay. So I kind of actually intuitively understood this when I was about 4 years old. I was learning to count, and my brother and I were playing a game, give me a bigger number, we kept, finding bigger numbers, and finally realized that we're never going to settle this. We can't get a biggest number. At the time, I didn't know what infinity was, but basically that's what was going on there. All right, now, okay. As you can tell, I get a little bit carried away on math. Now, when it comes to God, all right, I think this is kind of the essence of his attempt back then. Given any concept of God we can imagine, it is always possible to imagine a larger concept of God. Therefore, God must exist in some sort of infinite way that is beyond our power to imagine him. All right, I don't know if I quite got that right, but even if I did, I don't think it's all that persuasive. But it's an interesting argument nonetheless, I think. So now the Austrian mathematician Kurt Gödel, I actually mentioned him in my in a previous video, in my series on worldviews and limits of knowledge. He proved a theorem in 1931, which had a lot of amazing consequences to what we're doing. Anyway, Gödel produced a proof for God that is logically correct. Now, he didn't share it. He was afraid he was going to get ridiculed by colleagues that, probably didn't believe in God. He just didn't want to open that can of worms. But he did share it with a friend, and eventually that was passed on down to us. So I read it the other day. It was on the internet somewhere, and Gödel was logically correct. Well, he was the world's greatest logician, mathematician specializing in logic, and probably still is the greatest ever lived. I don't know, but anyway, his theorem, okay, proving the existence of God, it requires accepting his premise of two assumptions. So he starts off with two assumptions. We might call them axioms in mathematics. And based on that, yeah, you can prove God. So, okay, that's kind of interesting, but I don't think it's going to convince everybody, okay? Just something tells me that. That's not going to be all that convincing. All right, so a sort of famous theologian recently, I I could say his name. I don't know much about him, and I don't want to appear to be too critical of the man. I think he's a very good guy. But when I heard him state this, it sounded like, oh, this is obvious. God has to exist. That was my perception. I don't know if that's quite accurate. But anyway, he recently declared that the proof of God is actually very simple. And it goes this way. So here's his proof of God. And really, it's not a bad argument, but I don't think it holds up. Okay, it doesn't mean he's wrong that and that there really is no God. It just means that I don't think this is going to constitute a proof. Anyway, it goes like this: if God did not exist, then there would be no reason for moral values or for morality. Some people can be moral, and so then God must exist. All right, so the the let me get that back up here. If God did not exist, then there would be no reason for moral values. Since people can have moral values, then God must exist. Now, logically, the first sentence is the premise to this proof. The second sentence logically follows from it. All right, and if you're studying math or logic, you know that we're talking about the contrapositive argument. Not important to really know that, but if you looked it up, contrapositive, you'll find out what that means. It's not that complicated. All right, so logically, this is consistent. So I say, well, it's not a bad argument, but atheists can argue that they have moral values, and they do. And I believe there are many atheists who are actually very good moral people. They just don't believe in God. And so perhaps they need, but they'll, but atheists can say that they have moral values and perhaps they need to get along in society as a consequence of evolution. In other words, these are necessary for natural selection to take place in a favorable way. We tend to have more that moral values, otherwise we bring down all kinds of bad consequences on us. So, and I think their argument's actually very good for that. So I that's why I have to kind of throw my cold water on this theologian's proof of God. All right, so there it is. Attempts to disprove God by scientists are philosophical in nature, and they require agreement on their premises. In spite of what they think, they have a set of premises, and if we believe that or go by it, then I guess they'd be right that there's no God. But we can argue that stuff. So, two relatively famous books in recent history. Biologist Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion. He's actually rather critical of us believers. He seems to be a nice enough guy, but he pretty much thinks that Christians are kind of stupid. They follow a very nice set of moral values. He likes that, but we're kind of, not very smart for believing in God. All right. Wow. And the mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, did I spell his last name right? There might be two L's there. Sorry if I got that wrong. He wrote, I think it was 1970, not long before he died. He published a book. It's thick. I've never read it. I haven't read The God Delusion either. But he published this book, Why I Am Not a Christian. I think that was the title. All I remember is saying, well, why did it take you 450 pages to decide that? Okay. So I think as a philosopher, he wanted to convince us that there's no basis for being a Christian. And that's why he's not a Christian. All right. By odd coincidence, he actually had a lot to do with the work I mentioned about Kurt Gödel. Okay. Long story. All right. We won't get into that. Now then, so the field of philosophy is really limited by our limits to knowledge when it comes to settling the issue of God's existence or non-existence. For everyone, and if you haven't watched the two-part video series I did, it basically means that there's some questions we can never answer, but since our language is always contains some ambiguity, there are some things that can be argued true one way and false another way based upon basic assumptions. And so I think this is definitely one on we can't argue. We can argue God exists, and we can argue that God does not exist. All right, and using some basis of assumptions, and never settle the issue. That's a limit to knowledge. All right, so for everyone, I think it just comes down to our personal worldviews, and that's all there is. All right, so here's a few points I'd like to make from my Christian perspective. And whenever possible, it's great to quote the Bible. I think that's a good idea, very good idea. When I can't think of a passage, can't find one, or whatever, I like to say, well, this is my opinion. Okay, so take it with a grain of salt if you'd like. That'd be totally fine. So if you seek God, if you look for God, then he will find you. And from the book of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 7 through 8, here, we'll read it. I know you can read, but I'll read it back to you. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be open. So this is the basis that ask and you shall receive. Quote, sometimes you probably have heard. It comes from this passage, evidently. Okay, here's my opinion. God will give you the evidence of his presence, but it's also his choice when and how to give it. And it may depend on your persistence. And another thing from my opinion is that I really believe God only acts in your best interests when you ask him for help. And if you ask for things that don't agree with his will for you, he may or may not grant you that. He may give you permission just based upon free will. I don't know, but generally it's the question of prayer and how prayers get answered. Oh, that's a big topic, and I don't know if I'm quite ready to try weighing in on it myself. There's a lot of people who have talked about those things, probably given it much more thought. But anyway, this is my opinion. Um, I can't say whether God responds to curiosity, but he does want your faith. And so you say, well, God, I'm curious about you. Do you really exist? Is he going to respond? I don't know. I don't know. But he does want your faith. So from 2 Corinthians 5 through 7, this is a kind of a famous statement. For we live by faith, not by sight. And okay, so and that's a very interesting sentence. And because I'll save that for later. Okay. But there are a lot of statements in the Bible about faith that are, pretty much along these lines. Okay, so my opinion, God's most dangerous gift to us is free will. Free will allows us the freedom to make good or bad choices, and even to deny his existence if that is our will. Well, look what he did in the Garden of Eden. All right, if that's true, God said, "Don't eat from the tree of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or surely you will die." Okay, and so he warned them not to do that, but he gave them the free will choice to do so. And so they committed the most colossal screw up in history. And by eating that, and then the world fell and on and on. Someday I'm going to do a really detailed commentary on Genesis, the book of Genesis, especially the first couple of chapters. And actually, these videos I'm doing right now are going to end up supporting a lot of that effort. All right, so looking ahead, part 2 of the series will show why science gives very strong evidence for why there must be a supernatural realm. All right, so as always, look below for links. I'll build in links as I come up with them. And if you like it, be sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share it with a friend if you can. Feel free to leave a note. All that helps this get more exposed out there through Google's algorithms. So. Okay, well, we'll sign off for now and go on to the next video.